Hello, friends. Our topic today is the great web of humanity and the question, am I my brother's keeper? In Matthew 25, Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and the goats. He commends the sheep for what they have done for him when he was in need, when he was hungry or thirsty, or a stranger in a foreign land, in need of clothing, sick, or even in prison. When they ask him, "When was that?" he replies, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." That's verse 40 from today's New International Version. Then he turns to the goats and he tells them, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Verse 45. Jesus identifies himself with the powerless, with the helpless, with the ones most in need, as if he himself were the one in need. He identifies himself with his own people too. In Isaiah 63, verse 9, it says, "In all their distress, he too was distressed. And the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and mercy, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old." Biblically, justice was the arm of government by which the powerless were delivered from the power of the powerful. Check out Psalm 72, verses 1 through 4. Isaiah 58 reveals a people who think they are serving God. They think they are seeking him out. They think they are eager to know his ways and that they have kept his commandments. They ask God to come near and act in their behalf, and they wonder why he seemingly remains distant. The Lord tells his prophet to wake his people up from their self-complacency. "Shout out aloud," he says. "Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the house of Jacob their sins." Isaiah 58, verse 1. "You don't know how wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked you yourselves are," he is telling them. "You don't know how unlike me you have become who you think you are serving. At the same time you think you are honoring me with your feasts, you are exploiting your workers. You are quarreling and arguing and assaulting each other. You live as if you don't even know who I am or what I am like. If you want my light to shine around you, my grace to heal you, my glory to be your defense, then have my heart. Loose the chains of injustice. Set the oppressed free. Break every yoke. Share your food with the hungry. Provide the poor wanderer with shelter. Clothe the naked. Do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. Spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed." Verses 3 through 10. All of this heart service of love and compassion to relieve the needs of the oppressed, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the pressing needs of those within the circle of our influence, is the essence of Sabbath keeping, as the chapter concludes. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then You will find joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land, to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Verses 13 and 14. Bringing rest to all within the circle of our influence is at the heart of true Sabbath keeping. See Exodus 23, verse 12. Jesus demonstrated this repeatedly. When he, on Sabbath, healed the woman who had been bent double for 18 years, his explanation was, should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what had bound her? Luke 13, verse 16. The Sabbath rest that we have been freely given in the redemptive grace and power of Jesus is to be made practical in the lives of all to whom we can be a blessing. Job, when he laid out his just life for his friends to see and understand, described it in terms of his care for the powerless of society. He said, "Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. Those who were dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I took up the case of the stranger. The cause which I knew not, I searched out. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth." Job 29, verses 11 through 17. This was Job's righteousness, which he put on as his clothing. This was Job's justice, which he wore as a robe and as a turban. In the winter of 1623, during the Black Plague in Great Britain, John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, was seriously ill. During this time, he penned a series of meditations. The most famous of these, meditation number 17, is famous for this excerpt describing the interconnection of all humanity. He wrote, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor or household of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." This past week, we watched, horrified and heartbroken, as Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, knelt with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, pinning him to the ground for nearly 9 minutes, ignoring George's plea, "I can't breathe." George died there on the street before our eyes from asphyxiation. Protests and riots have erupted in cities across our nation and in many other cities on every continent around the world against police brutality, against lack of police accountability, against police racism. News of this event comes on the heels of other tragedies. Ahmaud Arbery was out for a run in his neighborhood when assaulted by vigilantes and killed. His assailants were not charged or arrested until the public outcry became too deafening to ignore. On March 13th, Breonna Taylor, an emergency medical technician, was at home in her apartment when plainclothes police broke into the wrong apartment to execute a search warrant without first identifying themselves. In the aftermath, Breonna was shot dead. The officers involved in the raid have yet to be arrested as of the 6th of June. If you weren't sure you could safely jog in your own neighborhood, if you weren't sure you could safely go to sleep undisturbed in your own bed, or buy a soda at the neighborhood market, how would you feel? How would you live? How would you respond? Ellen White spelled out the sure results of a monopoly of power and wealth by a privileged class. She said, "The Lord would place a check upon the inordinate love of property and power. Great evils would result from the continued accumulation of wealth by one class and poverty and degradation of another. Without some restraint, the power of the wealthy would become a monopoly. And the poor, though in every respect fully as worthy in God's sight, would be regarded and treated as inferior to their more prosperous brethren." The sense of this oppression would arouse the passions of the poorer class. It would be a feeling of despair and desperation, which would tend to demoralize society and open the door to crimes of every description. The regulations that God established were designed to promote social equality. These words first appeared in the Review and Herald, September 17, 1889, and you can read them in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 534. But over and over again, we have witnessed the results of grinding poverty that leads to despair and desperation. People are tempted to go to any lengths to survive physically and or emotionally. Society is demoralized, and the door is open to crimes of every description. Our natural inclination is to distance ourselves from contamination by contact with such elements in society. It is comfortable to keep it at arm's length from the comfort of the couch in front of the TV, and to decry the wrongs committed by the oppressed, almost as if they themselves are the cause of their own troubles. We forget that we are all connected in one great web of humanity. In family systems theory, we learn that all members of the family are interconnected. What one does affects every other person in the family system. When there is significant pain in the family system, one member of the family may start acting out, medicating the pain with unsafe behavior in an attempt to survive emotionally. The family then identifies that problematic person as the one with the problem, relieving the rest of them of that sense of complicity. A family systems therapist, however, would recognize that the problematic person is simply a system a symptom of a sick family system, rather than the problem itself. The underlying problem, the root cause of the problematic behavior, must be addressed by the family as a whole, and the source of the pain be discovered, resolved, and healed. In 1896, Ellen White wrote an article under the title, "Am I My Brother's Keeper?" In the very first paragraph, she says, the American nation owes a debt of love to the colored race, and God has ordained that they should make restitution for the wrong they have done them in the past. Those who have taken no active part in enforcing slavery upon the colored people are not relieved from the responsibility of making special efforts to remove, as far as possible, the sure result of their enslavement. When the duty of bringing the gospel to the colored race is presented, many make the plea that association with the colored people will contaminate society. This was written in around 1889, I believe. But we find some of that still true today. She continues, this very plea is evidence that means should be instituted to remove from this race the degradation that has been brought upon them. As a people, we should no longer say by our attitude, "Am I my brother's keeper?" On the contrary, we should arouse ourselves to do justly, to love mercy. We should make manifest by our actions that we have the faith for which the saints are to contend. We should go forth to seek the oppressed, to lift up the fallen, to bring help to those who need our assistance. Review and Herald, January 21, 1896, and reprinted in 1901 in the Southern Work, page 54. In the family system of American society, many of the rights and privileges to which the favored classes have access are nearly out of reach of those less favored. In the family in which I grew up, my father favored me over my sister. Now, I was wholly unaware of the unequal treatment. I thought my sister was just as privileged as I was and was treated with the same respect and expectations with which I was treated. My mother and sister, however, saw things differently. They recognized the favoritism, the different way in which the men in the house were treated from the women in the house. I couldn't see it. But many years after my sister and I were grown and had families of our own, our father admitted that what my mother and sister had perceived was in fact true. And that brought some measure of healing to them. In 1959, John Howard Griffin, a white journalist from Mansfield, Texas, decided to do an experiment, a journey across the Deep South. And he started in Louisiana, and he went across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Arkansas, passing as a black man. It was a period of high racial tension. Don Rutledge traveled with him to document the trip. John Griffin discovered the color of his skin changed the way he was perceived and treated. He became accustomed to the hate stare received from whites. When there was a question of seating on a bus, the white lady who wanted his seat insulted him and started talking to the other white passengers about how impudent the blacks were becoming. The book detailing his experience was published in 1961 under the title Black Like Me, A White Man Learns What It Is Like to Live the Life of a Negro by Becoming One. But even there, he knew that there was going to be an end to his experience. And he didn't know what it was like to foresee a life in which that experience would never have an end. I know a mixed race family where the white wife told me she could work out a loan at the bank over the phone. But when she and her black husband showed up to sign the papers, there was often a reason the funds were not available to loan them. Those of us who are favored by society don't know the obstacles that are in the way of advancement to those less favored, because we simply don't run into those obstacles ourselves. We grew up in neighborhoods with good schools and with classmates who knew they could make something of their lives. Things are far different in schools located in poor communities with limited apparent opportunities for economic advancement. It is hard to get up the motivation to achieve when it seems pointless. The movie Stand and Deliver tells the story of Jaime Escalante. He was an engineer with a good job, but he saw a need and an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of students at Garfield High School in East Los Angeles. He quit his engineering job and became a math teacher. Expecting much from his students, he motivated them to perform and to raise their sights and aspirations. They gained a will to succeed, to strive to achieve, to focus on the things necessary for advancement and success. As their competence rose, he decided to teach them calculus. That was almost unheard of in the part of town he was teaching. In a school system where students were prone to drop out, he inspired these students to excel. 18 of them eventually passed the advanced placement calculus exam, giving them college credit. And they went on to make something much more of their lives than had been expected from their roots. The work of education must begin at the very foundation. It must be very practical. Real charity helps people help themselves. Ministry of Healing, page 195. Mingle among them as one who desires their good. Show sympathy to them. Minister to their needs. Win their confidence. There is need of coming close to people by personal effort. If more time were spent in personal ministry, greater results would be seen. The poor are to be relieved, the sick cared for, the sorrowing and the bereaved comforted, the ignorant instructed, the inexperienced counseled. We are to weep with those who weep, and to rejoice with those that rejoice, accompanied by the power of persuasion, the power of fervent prayer, the power of the love of God. This work will not, cannot be without fruit. Ministry of Healing, page 143. It is God's purpose that the rich and the poor shall be closely bound together by the ties of sympathy and helpfulness. Those who have means, talents, and capabilities are to use these gifts in blessing their fellow men. Page 194. We are all woven together in the great web of humanity. And whatever we can do to benefit and uplift others will reflect in blessing upon ourselves. The law of mutual dependence runs through all classes of society. The poor are not more dependent upon the rich than the rich are upon the poor. While the one class ask a share in the blessings God has bestowed upon their wealthier neighbors, the other need the faithful service, the strength of brain and bone and muscle that are the capital of the poor. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 534 and 535. The interests of the different classes of society are indissolubly united. We are all woven together in the great web of humanity, and we cannot, without loss, withdraw our sympathies from one another. It is impossible for a healthy influence to be maintained in the church when this common interest and sympathy does not exist. Gospel Workers 331. Alan Parker, a professor in the religion department at Southern Adventist University, posted this short essay on his Facebook page on June 4, in the week following the George Floyd murder. It is apparently in response to the idea that talking about race is getting off topic when it comes to the gospel. He wrote, "Why can't we get back to preaching the gospel instead of talking about race?" This question would have been absurd to first century Christians. The compelling dilemma of their time was how Jews and Gentiles could be part of the same faith community. Gentiles were unclean. You couldn't sit with them. You couldn't eat with them. You couldn't touch them without being contaminated. And yet, they are brought into the Jewish church. The gospel is intricately tied to questions of race and ethnicity. Jesus commends the faith of strangers and Gentiles. He stays in a Samaritan town for 2 days. Imagine what that was like for the disciples. The Great Commission to go to every tribe, every ethnic group, every language and people is mind-blowing to the racist mindset of the Jewish disciples. Race and ethnicity dominate the book of Acts, and they are the backdrop for the expose of the gospel in Romans and Galatians. In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. And these questions are resolved with the healing of the nations in Revelation. The gospel is the story of the other, reaching across the great divide to love his enemy on the other side. It is when God steps into the world and incarnates himself in our different culture, walks in our shoes, loves us, and eventually dies for us. No wonder that racial barriers fall in light of the gospel. Its very essence is to break down the dividing wall of hostility between the races, Ephesians 2:14. We cannot talk about the gospel and ignore racism. Paul was willing for the sake of the gospel, to stand up and oppose it vehemently, as we read in Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. He did it not to make a political point, but because he believed in a church that was made up of believers purchased from every nation by the blood of Christ. He says in Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." It is easy here in northern Maine to feel like the events of this week, the murderer George Floyd and all the ensuing protests, riots, and mayhem, is in a different world, far removed from our quiet neck of the woods. We can sit back and watch it on the TV and relax because it's not here in our town. It's not here in our village. It's not here in our rural setting. And yet, it is. As Pastor Judy and I have ministered here in the county, we have been grateful for the relative peace of a small rural community. And yet, even here, racism is not dead. The gospel, however, is not simply blind to race. It is actively anti-racist. It has torn down the wall of partition between the races. The gospel was not meant for Jews only, and we can be grateful for that. It was meant for everyone. The great revelation of the gospel is that God became one of us. God became human. God gave his only begotten Son, Emmanuel, God with us. There is no separation between us and God. Christ in you, Christ among you, Christ around you, Christ in you, the hope of glory. In him, all humanity is one. When we begin to understand that Christ in me cannot stand apart from Christ in you, cannot stand apart from Christ in the least of these, when we begin to identify ourselves with the least of these, as Christ did when he said, "As you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you have done it unto me," then we have the heart of Jesus. Then we have heaven in our hearts and breathe its atmosphere. When we see ourselves in George Floyd, when we feel the knee of the police officer on our necks, pinning us to the ground, when we see in George Floyd our brother, our sister, our father or mother, then we may begin to understand how we ourselves can be a part of the solution and begin the process of healing in the family system. It did happen to us. The bell did toll for us. Jesus declares in solemn indictment that it was him pinned to the ground, crying, "I can't breathe." until he, in the person of George Floyd, breathed his last.